Hello, friends. Today I am joined by my priest, Father Samuel Keys. We're going to talk about the Ordinariate, what it is, and is it really Catholic, and what it means to be a part of the Ordinariate. Father Keys, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. How about you?
Doing all right, thank you. So, tell me a little bit about yourself before we start here.
Oh, sure. So I'm pastor of St. John the Baptist in Bridgeport, PA, as you know, and been here for not quite a year and a half. Oh, wait, no, it is a year and a half. Sorry, almost not quite 2 years, I should say. So about a year and a half, something like that. Summer of 23, I think it was. And most before that, I was in Southern California. Before that, I was in Maryland. I've kind of been all over, but I'm a relatively new Catholic when it comes down to it. I was received into the church in 2019, and had a brief stint as a layman before then being ordained to the diaconate and the priesthood in 2021. And of course, I was an Episcopal priest before I became Catholic, which is how I have the special dispensation from the Holy See uh, well, it was a dispensation to get ordained as a married man. So
Yeah.
uh, that's I guess, most proper way to put it. Uh, and so, yeah, I have 6 kids who live here in the rectory, and which is interesting and challenging in all
Yeah.
sorts of ways. But it's a good place. I'm originally from Mississippi. Um, if you want to know, I think that's enough about me. But
Yeah, yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, I didn't realize you came in the same year as I did. April 20th of 2019 for my wife and I. We
okay,
came
yeah.
in. I don't know if it was Easter for you or not, but
You no, you beat me. I came in at
okay.
Pentecost.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah.
this is gonna be our first year since coming into the church that Easter falls on the same day that it did when
Oh,
we came
okay.
in. So 420.
Yeah, that makes
Um,
sense.
But Great. So tell me about the ordinary. What is the ordinary? When I tell people, like, I talk about it, with people, they ask, "Are you part of the local church here, or do you go? What diocese do you belong to?" They always look at me sideways, like, "Wait, are you really Catholic, or are you one of those Anglo-Catholics that just kind of, cosplays as a Catholic?" Is the ordinary really truly Catholic? What is it? How does it work? Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So what it is the equivalent of a diocese. Uh, it's the equivalent of the diocese, so I guess technically it's not a diocese because a diocese is geographically defined. Uh, but it functions like a diocese in every other way. But instead of being geographically defined, it's personally defined. So it's defined as uh, the kind of particular church for this group of people who are affiliated with it. And this structure was set up basically at the vision of Pope Benedict XVI, who, as a result of many years of kind of conversations and overtures between various groups of Anglicans and the Catholic Church, uh, Pope Benedict really kind of saw this uh, opportunity to create a structure within the Catholic Church for people coming out of Anglicanism who had their own, well, he used the term treasures. I mean, their own kind of gifts that had developed even in the situation of separation from the fullness of the Catholic Church. There were gifts which had developed all the same, which the language he used, that they tended towards Catholic unity. So the way that I always described it is that what he means by that is that when I decided to become Catholic, it didn't involve for the most part, there's some exceptions here, but it didn't involve a kind of rejection of much of what I had experienced and believed as an Anglican. It was something that actually developed fairly naturally from within that Anglican context. I mean, it's like it's like almost the kind of Anglican, at least the flavor of Anglicanism that I experienced. It like wanted to become Catholic, and 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 so kind of reached its full maturity in the communion of the Catholic Church. Uh, One of the priests that I know, well, the priest who first heard my first confession as a Catholic, he also made this journey, and he always liked to say that he realized that all the things that he liked best about Anglicanism were actually Catholic, I've said that as well. So for me, it wasn't a huge like shift because I was already like teaching and believing like the vast majority of what the Catholic Church believed and taught. It was just kind of making that final commitment to enter the full communion and it's an act of obedience and submission. But anyway, Pope Benedict, I think, recognized that that's a little unusual, like that idea of a kind of tradition that in itself is like tending towards Catholicism. And he recognized that as unique. And I think he also just had a certain experience of the kind of beauties of Anglicanism and things that it had preserved. I mean, he visited England at some point, like I think it was the year before the Ordinariates were announced,
which was
and
2010, I think, right?
yeah, and he went to Evensong at Westminster Abbey, and like he visited like the tomb of Saint Edward the Confessor, and like and I think that he was Saint Pope Benedict is somebody who had a real heart for reverence and liturgy and music and things like that, and I think he saw what the at least the cathedral tradition of choral institutions in the Church of England had retained, and in many cases, like these institutions, like had just kind of gone on unbroken since well before the Reformation.
Right.
And so it's kind of interesting that like some of those things which had been kind of discarded by mainstream Catholicism in much of the world, including in much of Europe, were actually held on to even by this like Protestant
Yeah.
church. And I think that's part of what he meant by the treasures of the Anglican tradition that he wanted to allow to come back into the Catholic communion. The other things that he meant, I mean, this is still kind of a subject of debate, but I think some of the language of prayer that was developed in Anglicanism, the Book of Common Prayer is say what you will about its doctrine and certain points, but there are definitely there's a kind of height of beauty in its language of prayer. I mean, it's the language of Shakespeare
Hmm.
that's basically applied to in some cases just directly to a translation of many of the prayers of the classical Roman Rite, but in other cases, new compositions. Like the famous prayer of humble access, which we use prior to Holy Communion, uh, and he recognized those are beautiful things that are fully uh, in in harmony with Catholic teaching,
Yeah.
um, and and it's just beautiful to be able to take those into the church and have them celebrated in the context of valid Catholic liturgy that's in communion with the Holy See and with Catholics throughout the world, and to create that as just yet another kind of option for uh, diversity in the Catholic Church. I mean, not every kind of Catholic liturgy and experience is the same. There is a variety there,
Hmm.
and this he recognized this as a new it's novel in a certain way to kind of create something out of this kind of former Protestant group. But I think it's at the same time like it's a novel version of something which just does exist in the church, which is different kind of cultural experiences of the faith, and even variations within the Roman Rite.
I've
Um,
I've
we
heard
have
from people smarter than me, or more knowledgeable on the topic than me, probably both, but that there was actually you had Henry VIII not gone into schism, which was a schism as I understand it until Edward VI. That it would have that the Trent actually would have probably made the English church in its own right. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm familiar with that, but uh,
yeah.
but some of these traditions may have been preserved. So we kind of
Yeah.
the fulfillment of that would have been seems to be maybe
Yeah.
the ordinariate to some
Well,
degree.
that's certainly true. I mean, like the reforms of the Council of Trent and the Missal of Pius V in 1570, like that was given universally to the whole church, but it was not actually in every case mandated for the universal church. There was
Hmm.
an option of retaining older usages, which in many places just kind of died out because there was a
Right.
certain
Like the Norbertines are still around, for example.
yeah, I mean, there was a certain kind of privilege of like, oh yeah, like we're going to take on the liturgy of Rome. That's cool because it's Rome, like
Hmm.
who doesn't want to be like that, right? But there were still local variations, and there was a variation in England, which we usually call the Sarum use. Sometimes the serum rite. Usually, that's kind of it's a bit of an obscure distinction that sometimes scholars and liturgists use to suggest that like it was still very Roman and very Latin in its overall shape, but so not like an absolutely distinct rite, but still a recognizable set of distinctions from what was practiced elsewhere. Um,
Yes, indeed.
yeah.
So you mentioned, serum use, and people are going to be familiar with the word Anglican use. A lot of people are at least, and that's often a question I get: Are you guys Anglican
Yeah.
use? And
Yeah.
so
So,
is the ordinary?
yeah.
I guess. Okay. I was going to say, is it different from Anglican use, and does Anglican use still exist?
Okay, yeah, it's so kind of two different questions, but yeah, yes, it is basically the Anglican use, but that language itself has been largely abrogated
Mm.
by the church. The Anglican use, I mean, this is kind of I didn't even mention this in talking about setting up the ordinariates, but there's this whole history before that of the Anglican use and the pastoral provision of Pope John Paul II, which was in the United States, where it was kind of a similar thing, where you had groups of Episcopalians and their priests who wanted to come into the Catholic Church together. They were given a special liturgy, which was basically it was called the Book of Divine Worship, and it was a kind
Mm.
of Catholicized adaptation of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, which is interesting, and and they called that the Anglican use. Uh, that was definitely like the kind of immediate parent or ancestor of our liturgy as we have it, but it's not the only one. I mean, so when our missal was made, that was one of the sources, but it wasn't the only one. And after some decades of practice, it was recognized that that particular usage was not really fully sufficient, partly because of just kind of issues with the 79 prayer book in the first place as not
Hmm.
being like the best kind of starting place. But in any way, most of the Anglican use, so the big difference would be that the Anglican use congregations were all they were congregations, they were parishes in ordinary dioceses that were set up by a local bishop.
Hmm.
And there was a process with the pastoral provision of ordaining married former Protestant ministers to the Catholic priesthood. And it was a very kind of drawn out process that was set up. And it was run sort of by the bishops' conference. There was a kind of delegate for it. And the pastoral provision does still exist. You can still find there is still a person in charge of that. It's pretty rare. But the Anglican use congregations were all, there's like one maybe lasting exception in the Boston area at this point,
Okay.
but all of them were folded into the Ordinariate. And Rome made it very clear that when the Ordinariates were set up, that was the intention, that
Okay.
those parishes would all leave the diocese that they were in, and they would join the ordinariate, and which again would be the equivalent of a diocese in law. So you can see like there's a difference like just structurally speaking,
Hmm.
whereas like the Anglican use was very dependent on the local bishop, whereas the ordinariate is not. It's an independent because it's like its own diocese, and so it can kind of run its own affairs. So we can set up parishes wherever we want without having to worry about like, well, we have there's a kind of natural bonds of affection which require that we don't like go and do things which are going to offend the local,
Yeah.
territorial
Not going to
bishop.
set up a cathedral across the street from the local one.
Right, right. But like at the same time, like it they don't actually have any, canonical relationship with us. It's purely in the kind of bonds of affection, the fact that we're part of the same church. We're in, so it's so we have this interesting kind of parallel structure, which is it's not entirely unique in the Latin Church. So we can also distinguish it from like the Eastern Rite churches, where the Eastern churches are also parallel jurisdictions. So like, if you're a Ukrainian Catholic in Philadelphia, you're not subject to the Archbishop of the Latin Church Archdiocese of Philadelphia. You're in fact subject to the Archeparchy of Philadelphia and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, right?
Right.
The Ordinariate's kind of it's similar but different in that it we are part of the Latin Church, so like we're part of the same code of canon law, same practices. So there's a much higher degree of kind of interchangeability between our priests, for example. So like the vast majority of Ordinariate priests like also have faculties in the local diocese. They could show up and celebrate Mass at a local parish if asked or needed, and vice versa, without really a lot of issue. It's not like whereas with the Eastern rites, like you can't just do that without like special permission by ritual faculties, which enabled you to celebrate a very different liturgical rite.
That was my next
Whereas
question. If this is considered, it seems like something between a rite and an autocephalous, like the autocephalous churches of the East versus the Latin Mass, where the Latin Mass is just a different uh form of the Mass under the same rite. It seems like something in between those two things. It's not its own
yeah,
rite, but it's also not under the local diocese like the TLM is. I
yeah.
guess, do we have our own laws, or we're not considered a rite distinct from the Latin? I mean, that's often how I describe it to help people understand. It's like its own rite, but we're not considered a rite, are we? We're Latin
No,
rite.
it's not considered as its own right. Our liturgy is part of the Roman Rite. We follow the code of canon law of the Latin Church. And you could describe it as a form of the Roman Rite, a variation of the Roman Rite, a use of the Roman Rite. The terms keep changing. I mean, that's unfortunately just part of the kind of trends and what people use.
Yeah.
Like 10 years ago, we could have said form easily because we were using in officially we were using the language of ordinary form, extraordinary form. The current authorities in Rome tend to dislike that
I see.
terminology for whatever reason. We don't need to go into that, but so that's kind of created a little bit of confusion actually in like, well, what is the preferred terminology?
Yeah.
Because they haven't really given an alternative. Because
It's funny because
obviously
Benedict, who was the Pope that came up with that ordinance, that
yeah, yeah,
language.
right. So like I mean, just practically speaking, it is a form of the Roman Rite. But yeah, how do we call it? Yeah, it's funny. I mean, what's interesting is that compared to every other form of the Roman Rite, um, the uh, the actual books themselves, the authentic, uh, kind of master copies, if you will, are in English.
Hmm.
That's unlike anything else, and because every other Roman Rite book has its kind of its formally promulgated versions are, of course, in Latin, and then you have the various kind of authorized translations in different territories. And for us, it's like no, the actual text itself, which is authorized, is in English in its original form, because that's part of what's being preserved is this particular expression of language that's part of uh, not just the Anglican patrimony, but really the kind of Anglophone patrimony
Hmm.
of the Catholic Church, uh, and that's kind of part of what we're preserving as well.
I was going to ask that because obviously English is it's an English, it's a Anglican use of sorts. Yeah, so English is going to be our dominant form. But anyone looking at the map of the Ordinary will see the three dioceses do kind of overlap with like Asia, and I think there's one in Southeast Asia, and then Japan has one. Are they going to be English if they go there? Would they be Latin, or do we have the option for doing it in Latin, or is it always going to be English everywhere, never a local
Uh,
language?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I actually I don't know the full way of answering that. it's hard for me to imagine it being in other languages other than English because just of the nature of what the tradition is that we represent. I mean,
Right.
it is the tradition of the Book of Common Prayer and the various kind of like Catholic kind of reframings of that in the history of Anglicanism. Um, and yeah, whether you could do that in other kind of modern vernaculars is I don't know. Like it's not a question that I would could fully understand. Maybe
Fair
give it
enough.
another century, and we'll, you know,
I
some
guess
kind of.
the
I mean, I don't know. Like this may be a place for like natural liturgical development. I don't know. I do know. I mean, as far as Latin goes, again, like the kind of authentic original version of it is a kind of hieratic Elizabethan English. However, I mean, especially when it comes to like the ordinary parts of the Mass,
Mhm.
you know, we are kind of bound by the general instruction of the Roman Missal. I mean, if you open our missal, the first thing in there is the general instruction in the Roman Missal. So it's
I
very
didn't
clear
realize that.
this is we have then our own secondary rubrical directory, which outlines the ways that we differ from the Roman Missal. But it's very clear, like this is a Roman Missal, you know.
Okay.
It's and so, one of the things that goes with that is like, the ordinary chants of the Mass can always be done in Latin because in the end, like it's still the Roman Rite. So it's always fine to like say or sing the Sanctus or the Agnus Dei in Latin because those are the kind of native forms of those things.
Mhm.
Whereas the other prayers, like there is, of course, a translation of the Prayer of Humble Access in Latin because, one was produced in Oxford or Cambridge years ago. You can find, copies of the Book of Common Prayer translated into Latin.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I have some of them here. Uh, but I don't really see that as ever being part of it, because that's more of an interesting academic exercise more than a kind of living tradition that's kind of developed naturally. Um, Now, there is often conversation among people in the ordinariate about you know you, about the serum use, or the pre-Reformation English use, and whether that might be someday some sort of quote unquote extraordinary form for the ordinariate. Uh, yeah, that's sort of a at this point, that's a pretty academic question. Like
I see.
I think it's interesting. I understand why people get excited about that. I don't really see it gaining traction anytime soon, given the kind of current attitude towards kind of older liturgical forms that seem to be prevailing in the hierarchy. Uh, but again, who knows? Like,
Yeah.
fast forward 100 years, we don't know where we're going to be.
Yeah.
And the serum use, there's been a lot of work on that in kind of scholarship and kind of recovering that because it is interesting. I think even just for ordinary people who are not ordinariate members, but like just seeing those kind of variations of the pre-Tridentine reforms is interesting to kind of
Mhm.
understand the Roman Rite and its history, and it's kind of it's actually quite beautiful. I mean, there was a strong tradition in the English in the serum use of troping, the ordinary parts of the Mass, where there's a sort of like standard, like it's almost like a liturgical commentary that's built into the singing
Hmm.
of like the Kyrie or the Gloria in Excelsis, where you know. That was like that wasn't unique to the English church, but it was something that was like really common there. That whether we should bring that back, I don't know. Like that's not really up to me to decide.
Yeah.
But it was certainly a variety that existed in the late Middle Ages.
Interesting. So the next question I have is maybe a two-part question. What is the mission of the ordinariate? And I guess that has a several layers, like for the clergy, for the laity, and then because the way the diocese is set up, for laity who are both present and afar. Not every laity like myself right now we're too far to even make it. So what does it look like to be a member of the Ordinariate? It's a mission for the Ordinary as a whole and for the individuals within it. What is that? What is the lay life or the ordained life supposed to look like?
Hmm.
Different from as distinct from a Latin rite, or a standard Latin rite Catholic, I guess.
So I mean, I think the mission of the Ordinariate is fundamentally that of the mission of the church. It's the salvation of souls and
Mhm.
the proclamation of the gospel, building up the kingdom, giving the sacraments, for the salvation of souls. So the existence of a diocese and a parish, a diocese is a particular church, a parish is a particular location where the church is. Those are all oriented towards that, and the sanctification of not just souls, but of a particular place where those individuals can come and receive grace and be kind of taught and formed and have a kind of communal life in the church together. So I see. I think the difference maybe with the ordinariate is, some of it is like time will tell. But I mean, as a new diocese, uh, we have kind of a practical emphasis on evangelism in that we were set up for people coming into the Catholic Church, making this decision to become Catholic. And so that's kind of like that's our thing. Like that's what's makes us unique. That like if you want to find a diocese where every parish like is really kind of on fire for the Catholic faith and like is like ready to welcome people into the Catholic Church and to explain why you should become Catholic and help you do that. Like we're a great place to do that. And that doesn't mean that like ordinary parishes and an ordinary diocese can't do that. But like often there are some sort of obstacles that come from like being well established, like the larger a parish gets, the more it becomes a kind of bureaucratic institution and like, oh, you got to get your kids the sacraments, so you enroll them in CCD with the other like 500 kids in there or whatever. Like there's a kind of Christendom kind of model there, which still exists and is being, kind of worked on. It's collapsing in some places and being kind of uh, renovated in others. But we just have a very particular focus on evangelism, and I think with our size, we tend to be smaller, so there's a kind of opportunity to welcome people in that much more personal way. I mean, I've said this before, like to me, it's the personal ordinariate. We don't tend to lead with that term personal because it's already wordy enough as it is. But
Mhm.
but I but I do think that personal, that word is very significant because um, it's in the end membership in the ordinariate is personal. Like it's not just where you live. It's like the fact that you have personally chosen to be part of this. But and I think our like people's experience of the church is very personal in that way too. When I look at our congregation, and I think with all the people there, like they all have their own kind of personal reasons for being here. Like sometimes it's because they were Anglicans and this was they're kind of following that call of conscience to enter the Catholic Church. For some of them, they were Catholics who were away from the church for many years, and they've kind of rediscovered the faith in this kind of new form um, in the ordinariate. But like all of those stories are just very personal.
Mhm.
And there's I don't think there's any kind of avoiding that. Because you can talk about like what makes us distinctive, like liturgically, but like none of, I mean, like a lot of those things could be replicated elsewhere, in whether in a sort of ordinary parish doing very reverent kind of ad orientem liturgy in a Latin Mass community. Um, the language you can't exactly replicate
Mhm.
elsewhere because that is something that's kind of unique to us. But there is a just very personal way of doing things. And there's a kind of a style to it. I mean, like it's not just aesthetic, but it is also there's a style to music, to style to liturgy. There's a style to pastoral uh, governance that I think comes out of our experience of Anglicanism and that is worth preserving. And it's kind of hard to pin down what all that
Yeah,
is. But I think when you point to just the kind of personal nature of things and the size, like you can start getting at a lot of it.
yeah.
Um, and so, why exist? I mean, so say that, continues over, many, many more decades and Lord willing it will. I mean, there's, why can have a continued existence? I mean, it's the same thing as with any other kind of unique expression. It's like, why have a Ukrainian church? It's like, well,
Yeah.
because that's our particular tradition, and that's where like this is where we have received the faith, and like it's a culture which has been transmitted to us. I mean, and so with the Catholic Church, there's an intrinsic value to that kind of tradition, and a recognition of those gifts, which are not all the same from place to place.
So
And
question,
so I think that's
oh, sorry.
important.
Question to follow up with that, I guess. Yeah, I remember you and I both sat through Mark's lecture on the Ordinariate and how it is different. It is different, but not other like other rites are. And part of the language of the documents that brought the Ordinariate into being talks about sharing the treasures of the English Church with the rest of the church. So what does that look like? What does sharing our patrimony and treasures look like in a way that is part of the Latin Rite? Is there any sense in which we are uh I guess as lay people, especially who are sometimes attending Bible studies and interacting with Catholics in the local area, even outside of our immediate parish, what does that sharing look like? Is there some special sharing there, or is it more just the in the context of the liturgy that that's meant to be?
Well, I definitely don't think it's just liturgy. I mean, like liturgy is a big part of it. Like, and I don't think we can. I certainly don't want to undersell that. I mean, I think there's a beautiful tradition of prayer that we have that is worth sharing. And again, even if people aren't kind of going to ordinary liturgies, I mean, we have the St. Gregory's prayer book, which we have, which contains many of these prayers, is something that any Catholic could appreciate
Yeah,
and I think get a lot out of just for their own kind of spiritual benefit. Um, so the liturgical side to it is a pretty big deal. And the thing that goes along with that, frankly, is the musical side to it. That's something that's a little bit harder because the I know that's something we struggle with here, and that like we have a kind of grand vision for it, but like there is a sort of institutional uh, uh, kind of investment that you have to make that requires, numbers and people and funding that's hard.
yeah,
But a big part of the kind of patrimony, that kind of treasure that we bring with us, is this tradition of the English cathedral and collegiate choral tradition, and that's something that I mean, honestly, I wouldn't be where I am without that. Like that's what brought me into Anglicanism and ultimately into Catholicism. So even though there's a certain kind of sadness that I don't have that fully right now, like that is a kind of a long-term goal, I think, for many of us to do what we can to kind of develop that because that musical tradition is I don't know. It's hard. It's really unique in
yeah.
that
It's
uh,
beautiful
it's
too.
uh, it's so rich in its variety. Like the fact that it's not just like English composers. Again, partly because of that weird history of like English choral institutions continuing to sing pre-Reformation stuff when everybody else forgot about it. And
Hmm.
so like, part of our tradition there is like, yeah, we sing like, these modern anthems with a very modern sound, like written in the 20th century with organ. But then we also sing Palestrina and Victoria and Josquin des Prez and like these kind of classic works of polyphony and Gregorian chant. Like it's all of ours. There's a sort of
Hmm.
like very expansive vision for what is part of the gifts of the church in terms of her musical heritage. And honestly, like in terms of the music, probably the true match patrimony is just like the quality. Like it's just an emphasis on the kind of excellence and doing it really well and training really well. So okay, so liturgy, music, and then beyond that, like the other kind of gifts that we share, is there's a kind of emphasis on education and the kind and having like a well-informed laity. That's really huge. I mean, and the laity's involvement in the kind of in the regular work of a parish. I mean, this is something we have, in a way we're still kind of negotiating because like a lot of we definitely have people who came out of Anglicanism and we had vestries where there was a lot of lay authority, and it's kind of hard for some people to kind of wrap their minds around the fact that like, oh, basically in the Catholic Church the pastor doesn't have to like ask permission for like
Hmm.
almost anything. I mean, like there are very few things where he really formally needs like a finance council to vote for it. And even then, it's more like it's not even a strict requirement. It's more like if you don't do this, you'll get in trouble with the bishop. Like, so, there's a kind of negotiation there. But there is a strong culture of lay involvement and where and I find that I mean it can be frustrating where like you have people who kind of have maybe too much of an expectation, but then it's also really great in that like there's this kind of understanding that like no, like these things should be shared with the laity and like it shouldn't just be like me doing this all on my own. I should be kind of consulting with with my lay leaders and figuring out what the best thing is to do for the parish.
Yeah.
And I think that then, the thing that, and so that's just on the side of governance, but then I also think that like that is closely related to a certain kind of Anglican habit, which is, partly just a Protestant habit of understanding that like, okay, the laity have their own responsibility to be well educated and well, informed in the faith. And it's not just like the job of the clergy to know, theology, to know what the church teaches. And in the end, like that's all thoroughly Catholic, but I think that just in practice, um, there is an emphasis there in kind of our tradition that, that is different from what you kind of experience as like the norm in the Catholic Church, where like it's not it's just not as unusual for like a layperson to be like, "Hey, I want to start this thing," like, and I sort of give my blessing and we're good. It's there's less of that sense of like everything has to be kind of, fundamentally channeled through the priest, to get done. So I appreciate that, and I think that's a thing where like the ordinariate members who are like not connected with an ordinary parish, like that's a place where they can clearly make their presence known uh elsewhere because if you're in an ordinary parish and you're like really like taking the faith seriously, trying to like learn about it, and you're willing to share that with others, you're willing to like be involved and take on like leadership roles, um like that's a real gift. And I think that's uh it's just kind of an emphasis where like, just most of our people are like that. Like it's just rare to find a member of the ordinariate who is just the sort of Catholic who doesn't really know anything and they just kind of show up. Like
Yeah.
that's just unusual. Like
Everyone there seems like they have some kind of degree related to the faith when I go there.
yeah. So like
It's
we don't have like and I think that's again that's a difference with our communities. I mean, it's like we're small, but like, you know, the majority of our people are really like committed disciples, and that you you don't have a lot of, I mean, I'm sure that this varies from place to place, but like one of the things I've noticed here is like we don't really have like, yeah, there are a lot of people here on Easter, but it's not really that much bigger than a normal Sunday, like, and part of that is because like there we don't
everyone
have a lot
goes on
of
almost Sunday.
people like most people who are committed like they're here like week after week unless they're out of town or whatever, like they're not, we don't have those a lot of those people who are just like, yeah, I'm Catholic but I only go to church once or twice a year. Like
Right.
we just don't really have those kind of people. And you know when sometimes those people visit us, they visit us once and then don't come back because like we're or in sometimes they get pulled in and they change, right? They
Yeah,
because we don't like that's not good enough. Like we don't like I've always said like if this is not a place where like you can be an anonymous person, like, an anonymous Catholic. Like if our people see somebody new, they are going to greet you.
yeah.
Like
That's what
and
my wife and I loved about the place when we came. It's
yeah,
just we were going to a Novus Ordo before we came into the church, but we were we were converted, but we hadn't been brought in formally yet, and we were decided to kind of look around to see what other rites there were. We kind of stumbled upon the Ordinariate, and we just loved that you couldn't be anonymous here. You sat from the moment you sat down, someone's greeting you, saying hi to you, they talking to you about who you are, and inviting you things, and just it was wonderfully social and it's the best of what I remember growing up as a Mennonite. When I go to the Mennonite church, we'd have lots of potlucks and everyone knew each other and then it's just you couldn't be a part of that community without being involved socially to some degree, and it's just it's the best of that
yeah,
while being Catholic.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and that, I mean that doesn't mean you have to be an extrovert. Like it's because I mean, and that's where like liturgically we're very well suited towards, a more kind of quiet, introspective experience, if you're looking for that. But in terms of our parish life, we do take seriously that idea that salvation is in the church, and that's a body, and it's not just kind of me and Jesus, and it's like me and Jesus and his body, and there's no other way, like, there's no kind of escaping from that, as much as
so
we
let,
might want to escape from it sometimes.
so I guess another several part question here, but what is the difference between being a member of the parish or a canonical member of the ordinary itself, and can anyone be either?
Okay. So being a member of the parish, okay, so formally speaking, to be a member of the parish of an ordinariate would be for a person who is a member of the ordinariate who basically like lives and is part of that parish. Um, people can register at a parish even though they're not ordinary members, but I wouldn't call them technically parishioners. Because they're not ordinary members, technically they would remain members of whatever geographical parish they live in. Registration though is just registration is not really a concept that exists in law. It's kind of an administrative fiction, if I might call it that, in that it's basically just a person's way of like publicly identifying, like, hey, I am going to kind of I'm settling down here. Like this is the place where I'm going to be actively involved as a Catholic, regardless of where I live.
Mhm.
And so we do sometimes have people like that where they don't really want to go through the hassle of becoming a member of the ordinariate, but they're still kind of committed to being at the parish and being part of its community, and so on. And uh, for I mean, I tell people like in the ordinariate though, like registration it does matter for us a little bit more, I think, than even in a typical parish because we're not geographical.
Mhm.
Because like in an ordinary parish, you're a member of the parish just because you live in it, and you're a Catholic. Whereas for us, like the only way I know who my people are as a pastor are when people tell me who they are,
Mhm.
like and that's so that does become important. And I mean, like spiritually, it's important in that like when I offer masses pro populo, like every Sunday and Holy Day, I have to offer masses for my people. Well, like I need some sort of like theoretical definition for what that means,
Yeah.
and registration is a way of understanding what that means. Um, uh, and yeah. And for certain things like where you require like a pastor's authority. So when it comes to like marriages, for example, like often you need the authority of your proper pastor. That's where it matters too, because if you're not a member, like I'm technically not your pastor. So like I can't actually give, permission or something. And I can't actually validly marry somebody who I don't who's not my parishioner. in the Ordinariate, because that's kind of how the law works.
Would it be actually
Um,
totally invalid or just illicit? Would there be a would there actually be an invalidated marriage by that?
it would actually, yeah, permission. Like, I think that don't quote me on this, but I think with when it comes to don't yeah,
No, that's fine. If you don't know, that's
I
fine.
think it's invalidating, but I could be misremembering that.
That's okay. That's okay.
It is
Sorry.
certainly important for a Catholic, like I think it may be invalidating because this is where like these kind of pastoral permissions really matter. Uh, but anyway, so the question about like who can be a member of the Ordinariate, um, it is of course originally designed for people who came into the church from Anglicanism, by extension from other Protestant groups. It's also for anyone who came into the church through the ministry of the Ordinariate, so like that's been clearly defined in law by Pope Francis that like because we have this kind of evangelical mission, you know, we are welcoming people into the church from whether they're being baptized in the church through our ministry or coming into full communion through us. So regardless of whether people were ever Anglican, if they're coming into the Catholic Church, through us, then they certainly can be members. There's a kind of there's a third category. Well, then anyone who's like family members of those people can be members. There's another category which is a little bit more subjective, and that's just that the if you look at the membership form, it talks about whether you are drawn to the church through the mission of the Ordinariate.
Mm,
Um, what that is really meant to mean, I think it like the basic intent at least was to include like lapsed Catholics who are kind
mhm,
of coming back to the church through the ministry of the Ordinariate. That's another kind of common thing where people they are Catholics, they've received all the sacraments, they just haven't been to church in 20 years, and so like those are very clearly, eligible for membership in the Ordinariate. Um, there is a kind of a gray area for kind of others who don't really meet those criteria, but are just kind of more generally drawn to it.
mm,
Um, and the way that it works practically is that we're sensitive about not we certainly don't want to give any kind of impression of like stealing people from the local parish, like uh in my experience, like that doesn't really happen,
yeah.
but if anything, it's from the parish, like many miles away, the but there's not this kind of actively going after those people. But I think there is often the experience of somebody who maybe they haven't technically been away from the church for a long time, but maybe like at least internally speaking, they're away from the church, right? They haven't like stopped going to church, but there's something about their faith that is kind of dried up, and encountering the ordinariate in our community gives them a kind of new fire and zeal that is life-giving to them. And I think so sometimes people like that where they, especially if they find the ordinary, they stick with us, they're really kind of they get involved. They fill out the form, they send it in. Nobody's going to stop them from joining. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah.
That like anyone who wants to really can, but we try to make sure that that's a serious thing and not just somebody who like, oh, I didn't like Father Smith's sermon last week, so I'm going to join this ordinariate, like it's we don't want it to be like on a whim,
Yeah.
somebody who's like escaping from something, or somebody who like, is, doing it for some sort of like weird ideological reason where they think it's going to like, this is like their strategy for like fixing things in the church. And like that's kind of a problem too.
Hmm.
So anyone who's like really kind of committed to that mission can join.
I don't want to keep you too long because I know I said an hour. Do you have time for a couple more questions real quick
Yeah,
or
sure.
do you
Yeah. Yeah, we
so
can,
so
yeah, we'll be quick.
Great, great. The ordinary as a layperson, I guess it's obviously different from something like a third rite, but are there any additional privileges or actually that's not the word I meant to say, responsibilities I meant to say, that would go along with the being a member of the ordinariate? Are there any what responsibilities for a canonical member would be additional to someone who's in the ordinariate as a member, not just
Uh-huh.
a registrant as you called it?
Okay. Yeah, so I mean the responsibilities are really not that different from an ordinary Catholic. I mean the difference would be, you do have you have a sort of implicit responsibility to support the ordinariate, like financially, with your time, all the kind of things that you would normally be obliged to do for, your parish,
Hmm.
there are some occasions where there are kind of matters of ecclesiastical law where there's an implication there. One I already mentioned, like with marriage, like with things like that, where you're getting the sacraments. Sometimes there are places where you really kind of need to have the permission or whatever from your proper pastor. So that's where it can make a difference. Like if you really, if you're really tied to and you love like our form of liturgy and you
Hmm.
live in a place where it's not, you do actually have a right as a member of the ordinariate to ask for that. Now you don't have a right to get it because there's like practical concerns there. But like you have a right to approach like a local diocesan priest and say, "Hey, I'm a member of the Ordinariate. I would really love to like help you organize and celebrate a mass in our form. Would you be willing to do that?" And like as a member, you have standing to do
That's
that
interesting.
in a way that you don't otherwise. Because like if a random priest of a diocese writes Houston is like, "Can I use the missal?" The question they're going to be asked is like, well, for whom? Like, because if it's just for you, if it's just kind of for your private amusement, then no. Like, but oh, you want to do that? You have a group of like, maybe it's just a few people,
Hmm.
but they've approached you and they really want to do that, maybe just on a very rare occasional basis. They're going to be like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, we can do that, and they might connect that priest with an ordinary priest to kind of make sure that he like knows how to use the missal or whatever. So that's something. There's also like, one of the most common like little things is when it comes to holy days of obligation. Uh, the in in almost every case, there's no difference with us and um, the ordinary churches, the diocese of the Latin Church under the USCCB. The one that gets a lot of people is Ascension Day because we do observe Ascension Day on the day on Thursday. So if you live in a part of the country, which is actually most of the country, where not in the Northeast, but most of the rest of the country, where Ascension Day is kind of bumped to the following Sunday, you do still have that obligation to attend Mass on the Thursday. And the other kind of little thing would be like with the Ember Days. So with the Ember Days in September and in Advent, uh, they're not really observed by most Latin dioceses, and the USCCB rules basically has a pretty generous interpretation of Friday abstinence, so no one is really bound to Friday abstinence from flesh meat in the United States. Whereas if you're a member of the Ordinariate, you are actually bound to abstinence from flesh meat on Ember Fridays in September and in December. So, but those are like, I mean, I can count those in one hand. I mean, like there's a very
Yeah.
small number of obligations that go with it. Um, but other than that, it's just kind of all of the things that of a normal parish, and then just that kind of basic mission that we talked about, which I think is just kind of it's in the water. It's
Yeah.
for us. You're not a member of one of our parishes without having some interest in our mission.
And this is a personal curiosity for me. Yeah, I've heard there are some differences here that are common, and I want to see what you have to say about that. If that is the case, maybe it's more rare than I've heard. But with Eastern Rite Catholics, you may have differences with theology that obviously the church has spoken on what it's spoken on. It's going to be the same across the board wherever you are. But then, with optional things like are you a Palamist, a Scotist, or a Thomist? In the East you're going to have more Palamists, in the West you're going to have more Thomists. There's some overlap because we're all Catholic, but do we have any kind of distinct theological views that you would find that would be common among ordinariate priests that wouldn't be as common among or even maybe unique to ordinariate priests that wouldn't be as common? One of the areas I've heard is some of the thinking on and I don't I heard it secondhand, so I couldn't actually speak to it myself. But some of the thinking on uh, perfect contrition, you're receiving the Eucharist when in a state of mortal sin, we have a different view on than some of the other Novus Ordo priests might have, or traditional Latin Mass priests might have. But I'm not familiar with what those distinctives are, and other distinctives that might exist as well that you're familiar with. I'm just curious.
No, yeah, I would say no. I mean, basically, in that I don't think there's any kind of um, significant difference like that. If there is, and I don't even know what you're talking about with perfect contrition. I don't know what the if I haven't heard that. The I mean, it's certainly possible that if you just like polled, every ordinariate priest and compared it, you might observe some differences in kind of theological emphasis, but I
Nothing
honestly
really
couldn't
stands
tell you,
out though.
I couldn't
Yeah,
tell you what those are. I mean, um, yeah, I mean, the sort of the patrimony, if you will, the kind of patrimony of the Oxford movement and the Tractarians uh, did have a very strong kind of patristic emphasis. So, that's something you might see, and that like I think you're much more likely to see an ordinary priest like quoting St. Augustine or St. Gregory the Great or any number of the fathers, or frankly, for that matter, any of like somebody like Thomas Aquinas or like some of the kind of scholastic theologians, you're much more likely to see that than you are to see them like going on about, St. Alphonsus Liguori or some kind of more modern Catholic figure.
yeah,
Um, and some of that's just like comes from experience. I mean, the fact that like in kind of Anglo-Catholicism separated from the Catholic Church, there was just a much more kind of a stronger emphasis on like the fathers and the medieval scholastics. And you really kind of didn't go much beyond like 1500. Like it was kind
mm.
of like, it gets too controversial then, like
It's
we
ironic because that's where everything
we
changed.
yeah, I mean, we certainly weren't interested in like we certainly wouldn't have quoted like Luther or like Zwingli or any other kind of Reformed theologians, but there was also a bit of a kind of wariness towards like some of the kind of modern Catholic figures. I think that kind of that's probably tempered as like most of us have been Catholic longer and we kind of get more exposed to some of these things. But that also kind of goes with some of the kind of Catholic culture where like I do think that like the you're gonna find like on the whole, again, it's kind of speaking very broadly, there's a much deeper kind of comfort with a figure like St. Thomas Aquinas than with like a modern um some of the kind of modern versions of Marian devotion, for example. Like not that they're
Mm.
not done or like or valued uh, or they're certainly not rejected or anything. They just remain, for some people, they remain sort of foreign to their experience of the Catholic faith. And so I think that's something that may kind of change with time as there's this kind of blending. I mean, like, I think many of us, as the Ordinariate goes on, there are aspects of it that become more kind of mainstream, but then hopefully there's also a way in which like our kind of culture influences other parts of the Latin Church. So it does kind of go both ways.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, other than that, I don't know. I mean, like you could say Newman, but like Newman's obviously a huge figure for us, um, but honestly, like a lot of people have probably never read Newman. I mean, like it's not, Newman's not like a particularly easy read. So even though like he's a very significant figure, And his theology, I think, is very important. It's not like some sort of alternative to kind of mainstream Catholic thinking.
Yeah. Well, that's probably comforting to anyone that might be questioning, how legitimate this is, and
Yeah.
is, but yeah. So I guess before we wind down, do you have anything else about the ordinariate or your parish or anything that you might like to say?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
Okay.
it's great. Yeah, like
Where
come join us, check it out if you you happen upon this,
where can
feel
someone
free
interested?
to.
Oh, sorry. Where can someone interested get more information if they want to just do some further home research?
Yeah, I mean, you can always go to the Ordinariate's website, ordinariate.net. You can, of course, look at parishes. I mean, but I think the number one thing would be to just show up in person.
Hmm.
There's only, I mean, look, I know that there's always going to be interest in this, like in a kind of abstract way, people who are kind of curious about it. But, fundamentally, again, it's a personal thing. So it's something that is not, it doesn't live on paper, like it lives in a real place. And that's really the heart of it. And so, I would advise against just going onto like the online fora about like, there are places online, of course, where you'll find discussion about the Ordinariate, and that's all fine, but like I think I think some of those places, as with many like church connected things, they can get really quickly like overwhelmed with people being kind of nitpicky or like negative about or like obsessed with like little rubrical details and it's not always the most kind of edifying thing.
Yeah.
Not that there aren't good people on there asking good questions at times, but I mean it really just needs to be experienced, and I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, fair enough. And it's a good experience to have visiting if anyone has one near them. Well, Father Keys, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me.
You're
I
welcome.
really appreciate your time. Have a great day.
All right, thank you.